It is literally the day before election, and a lot of people have got either election fatigue or election fever, depending on what's going on with the elections and how you've been handling the elections. I've actually got a friend of mine, Jan Cromartie, that is in Milwaukee, one of the bellwether states, and all along those lines. So a lot of people will be paying attention to that swing state and everything along those lines. There are seven of them, including the state where Jan and I are from, which is North Carolina. But as a longtime Democratic operative, I would say, and everything like that. He has been sent to Wisconsin to work the polls in that particular state. And I know he's been on our network a few times since the election and has talked about how things are being received there. I know here in North Carolina, I think we had a record setting turnout in all in that space for early voting. And I was actually talking to another friend of mine earlier today, and he was saying that he has heard through the grapevine that Trump will not be winning, but I've heard that it's a neck and neck tie and all along those lines. So it is definitely going to be very close to see how this all plays out and all along those lines. And I am of the opinion that nobody really knows. Maybe my first guest and only guest on this particular edition of the radio show might have some ideas and might have some ideas as to which way it is going, because he talks about a number of these very important things, including some of the institutions that are out there, because we were actually just talking earlier today on the media show about how media has impacted the race and all along those lines. And as a journalism major, have been studied under many great professors, one of them being the former press secretary for Lyndon B. Johnson when I was at Marquette University, and all along those lines, I sometimes am frustrated by the nature of media and how media can sometimes get into the sensational side of coverage and all along those lines. And a lot of people, in my mind, especially with the popularity of social media, have found silos that they are covered, that they are comfortable with. I would argue that many MAGA voters are probably spending a lot of time watching Fox and all along those lines, whereas some of the more liberal and progressives might be spending a lot of time watching MSNBC. And as a fan of Walter Cronkite back in the day and Charles Kuralt, I sometimes wonder where are the journalists of that type and all along those lines. But I'm going to bring in William Cooper and see what his thoughts are around this, because he has written a very important book and all along those lines, and maybe he's got some speculation as to what we can expect on tomorrow, even though I'm also hearing some people guess that we may not even know, like we didn't know in 2020 until a day later or a week later, or who knows what, if it's as tight as folks are speculating. And I've also heard some people, including some that are in the betting space, because one of our panelists that is on our World Edition is into the poly market, and he was talking about a possible Trump landslide. I don't know that I see that, but other people may see it, and all along those lines. So really quickly, if you would kind of introduce yourself to our audience, William, and also say where you are thinking we could be heading on this day of the election. In past elections, I had done some campaigning, some door-to-door canvassing, did not do as much this time around, even though I did get enough number of letters from all kinds of candidates, including the candidates from here for governor, both Josh Stein and Mark Robinson, because, you know, we've got a very hotly contested governor's race here in North Carolina and all along those lines. And I did, because I was into Daybreaking, which is the kind of rave scene during the pandemic, and they organized a party to the polls on the first day of election early voting. So I did participate in that, did my voting weeks later, or actually right at the end of early voting and all along those lines, and actually had to get a new voter's ID, because that's one of those things that you had to get, and my old ID, the state ID, had been much expired. So I was actually pleasantly surprised that it did not take as long as I thought it might take to get it, even though there was a young person in line with me, and they were a little bit frustrated that they had to go through the process. But at 62, maybe I had a little bit more patience than the young teenager did, or the young adult, because they might have been in their 20s and all along those lines. But what is your take on the election and what we can expect on tomorrow, since that is the final election day and the official election day and not early voting? And like I said, I do have Jan that's in Wisconsin. I'm here in Durham, North Carolina. I know a lot of people are paying attention to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada. We actually have another close friend that lives there, and one or two other states. I believe Michigan's in that list as well and everything. But what is your take as to what we can expect on tomorrow?
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here. I will introduce myself, as you asked. Will Cooper, author of How America Works and Why It Doesn't. And for your question, I think tomorrow is going to be quite a day. I would be surprised if it's fully resolved. I think there's going to be enough drama and activity that the odds are above 50% we do not get a full resolution tomorrow. I think it could extend multiple days, potentially even a week. If it's close, I think it could drag on for weeks in the courts. I mean, Bush v. Gore dragged on for weeks. That was at a much more civil, less polarized time than today. So if it's a really close election, and I don't think that's necessarily likely, but if it's a really close election, it could drag on for a very long time. My prediction is 1 to 2 days, but the outer bounds is in the weeks.
Why do you think we are in such a divisive time? I know that your book somewhat talks about this, but just out of curiosity, it does seem, and I was talking about it earlier, because one thing that caught me off guard this morning was we lost a musical legend, and all along those lines, and I mean, he is definitely up there in age, so I shouldn't be surprised in the sense that he passed away. But one of the achievements of Quincy Jones was a very popular song called "We Are the World" and everything. So it was definitely about unifying us as a people, and there were other things around that same time, like Farm Aid and Live Aid, and a number of other projects that seem to unify us as I would argue, not just a nation, but a world. But it definitely seems in the United States that we have people that literally are divorcing each other over even friendships, not just marriages, over certain stances that they have, whether that's LGBT rights or whether that's bathroom rights or a number of other things. So in your mind, why do you think we are as divisive politically as we seem to be?
Well, I think there's three factors that all combined have to lead us to being as polarized as we are. The first is age-old cognitive bias. We all have it. It's part of being human. Confirmation bias, where we interpret facts consistent with our existing worldviews. We all have it to different degrees, but it's just a part of human nature. That's been exacerbated by the second element of the three, which is social media and the internet, where you can gravitate towards what you want. You can avoid what you don't want when it comes to political content. And that just makes those biases even more pronounced. And what you would want in a political system, when you have a population that has those exacerbating biases, is a political system that dampens that passion, that calms the polarization. But ours does the opposite. It turbocharges them with the two-party system, where you have two juggernauts battling every day, gerrymandering, closed primaries, and other deficiencies. So it's really the three things: cognitive bias, the internet, and the political system. You combine those together, it's a flywheel spinning really fast in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and that's one of the things we talked about on the media show, which is earlier today and everything. Because one thing that I brought up, and I'm not knocking certain publications, I'll just bring it up to you and see if you agree or disagree with me. But when I was growing up, and I grew up, like I said, I'm in my early 60s, so I grew up in the 70s and the 80s in terms of teen years and early adult years and all along those lines and everything. And I remember a lot of publications that in this day and age would be considered biased, but a lot of people read them whether they agreed with their views or not. I literally remember a paper, and I know that this can be a loaded term, but I do remember a paper that literally was called The Progressive. That was the name of the paper, and all along those lines. And some people that read it, I don't think were necessarily progressive. I think it might have been some conservatives that read that paper, just like there were conservatives that read The New Republic. And where I might get myself in trouble with some of my evangelical friends and everything is, to me, and I could be wrong about the history of it, but I think Reader's Digest was basically started as almost like a Christian publication and all along those lines. And I could be wrong about that, but that's the impression that I got. It has some strong Christian viewpoints, if not strictly Christian, and all along those lines. But it seems like people were willing to read papers and study things that might have been against their views and everything. I even remember papers that were dedicated to like motorsports, and I don't even drive today, but it wasn't. But you would maybe pick them up, and even magazines like Playboy and Penthouse might have articles that had people from different viewpoints and everything. And they were definitely targeted newspapers like Mother Earth to me, and Mother Jones were definitely Mother Jones progressive, and Mother Earth, I would argue, environmentalist. But people didn't seem to have as much of that. While there was probably confirmation bias then, and I know that that's a term that people use a lot, it didn't seem like it was stopping people from going to read things that were opposite of their own personal viewpoints and everything. Whereas now everybody seems to be going toward what their media is that is addressing and backing what they're saying. Am I misreading this, in your opinion?
I think you nailed it. I think that's exactly right. People want, not everybody, but a lot of people, a big chunk of people consuming political news, they want to get their views reinforced. It feels good. The psychic pleasure of hearing somebody articulate something that you agree with, that supports your tribe, your team, is critical of the other side. That's what people want. It's not about being accurate. It's not about sifting through the evidence to be, arbiters of the truth in any sort of objective way. It's just rah, my team, my tribe, my political party. And that's what people want more and more. And American media ecosystem, much more than historically, is able to provide that and give that to people. And that's what generates clicks and money and large followings and things of that nature.
Yeah, I can definitely see that and everything. But another thing that happened with American media, and I don't know, well, I mean, it was big even in the day of what people would call yellow journalism and all along those lines, because we did have a period of time when papers and newspaper and media were controlled by some major institutions and all along those lines. I'm thinking about the Hearst Empire, because like I said, I did major in journalism and all along those lines, and there were others that were similar to Hearst, and you even had the newsboys that would be out there chanting to get you by their paper and all along those lines. But now it seems like, in my understanding, like I said, I've been in media since graduating from college back in December of '84, so it means I've been in this field for about 40 years in one form or fashion or another. A lot of it seems to be corporate driven and seems to be very much corporate monopolies, for lack of a better term. I want to say it's like maybe 5 media institutions that own the bulk of the media out there and everything. So is that part of the problem as well? And is that part of what your book is dealing with? Because that's where I sometimes get frustrated as one that went into media hoping to be, I'm just going to tell you what I was hoping. When I went into media, I was definitely hoping to address some of the issues, whether it was environmental, whether it was race, or a number of other things. I did love the notion of being a investigative journalist, and I admired the works of Woodward and Bernstein and what they did with Watergate, and maybe was hoping to go in that same kind of path and all along those lines, even though a lot of the stories I did even back then were human interest and everything like that. But how much should we be concerned about the corporatization of the media, for lack of a better term?
It's an important factor. I actually think it was worse before social media, before websites were able to give lots of people voices. So I think now, several decades ago, there was a very small number of players controlling everything. NBC, CBS, ABC, the major newspapers, certainly the local papers throughout the country as well. But it was a little bit more concentrated, I think. Those powers are all still there here today, and they have a lot of influence, and they can be very pernicious at times in how they cover things. But what we have today is an ecosystem that includes that, but also includes a lot of other people. I mean, there's, as we are here now on your podcast, right? There's lots of podcasts, lots of bloggers, there's Substack, there's Twitter. So you have a mix of big corporate behemoths controlling lots of information, and then a fragmentation of other sources as well. So I think it's quite a mixture today of both elements.
Yeah. But the title of your book is How America Works and Why It Doesn't. And it's definitely a brief guidance as part of what we're talking about and everything. So in your mind, what are some of the reasons, you kind of touched on them, went more on the media, but what are some of the reasons that government doesn't work? Because I mean, even here on this network, we had David Walker, who was a former comptroller general and regularly does an economic show with us and everything. And he had this, he was part of the No Labels movement and everything. And he was also part of the effort to have candidates that probably will, if they're lucky, get somewhere between half a percentage to maybe a percentage or two of the vote and everything, because I know he had the Constitutional Party and the Green Party and the Libertarian Party on a debate recently, and there were other candidates that were on, because I think they did like 3 or 4 debates and everything, and we aired it here on Pod TV. I know it aired on CNN, but a lot of people would say that while there's been this notion of having a third party, I mean, as far back as Lola Falani and some of the others as well, we pretty much stuck in the 2-party system, and I don't know that we'll ever get out of the 2-party system, just like I don't know that we'll ever get out of the electoral college, even though I know that there are people that would like both of those things to happen and everything like that. So what is your thoughts on the U.S. political system and whether it can be reformed, or should it even be attempted to be reformed?
Well, there's lots of deficiencies. I'm strongly in favor of reform. It's really hard. I mean, the Electoral College, for example, is right there in the Constitution. It made more sense when it was enacted than it does now, but we can't just abolish constitutional provisions without going through the right process of an amendment, which is very difficult to do. Gerrymandering is just a very awful practice where legislatures are supposed to be there protecting the people and representing the people with respect and dignity, just flagrantly rewrite districts for partisan purposes and disenfranchise huge swaths of the population in the process. And then you've got the two political parties that you mentioned, I think rightly. You've got the Democrats, Republicans. Third parties can play spoiler every now and again, but they never actually get traction and actually rival the Democrats and the Republicans when it comes to power. The Democrats and the Republicans are not, in my view, very good typically at formulating policy, but they're extremely good at holding on to their monopoly, right? It has been just Democrat versus Republican in this country for decades and decades and decades. It's really hard to break in. The incumbents are very good at maintaining their power. Now, if we did have third party, it wouldn't solve everything. Multi-parties create their own problems. There'd still be all sorts of gridlock, social media, and human bias. All of those things would still be there, but I do think it would help. And what it would do, having a third party in there as the key of any reform, Mark, I think would be, it would directly address the single biggest problem we have in our politics, which is just this polarization that's rooted in a lack of ideas, a lack of a vibrant marketplace of ideas. You're either a Democrat idea or a Republican idea. And there's lots of issues that could use many, many different voices, different angles, different perspectives. So I think it would be very positive if we got a third party in there, but much easier said than done.
Yeah, much easier said than done and everything. You bring up a couple of points, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around both of these and everything. Because my understanding, and I'm not knocking it because you would definitely fall in that category, even though I am a light-skinned African-American. Some people that were watching it might see the light-skinned more than the African-American part and just assume that I am part of that other class of people, meaning European Americans and all along those lines. But I am not, just happen to be one of the lighter-skinned versions of the African-American population. But one of the things that talks about in that sense and all along those lines is this notion of what was being created and everything. And I'd just love to hear your constitution of equals and everything allows so that were created in the early government and all along those lines. Women didn't get the right to vote till much later, and African Americans and other minorities as well. But there is this notion that it was a society created to where all men are supposed to be created equal, even though it was created at the time of slavery. So that becomes a paradox that some people have a hard time dealing with. It just like there's this notion, even though it is my understanding from some of my friends, including some Christian ministers, that it is not in the Declaration of Independence or any of the other declarations that we are a Christian nation. But you watch some of the politicians on both the left and the right, you will get the impression that it is a Christian nation. But I think a past guest on one of my shows actually brought up that some of the things like the Christian element that is brought up on the dollar bill and some of the other things weren't actually instituted until well into the 19th or maybe even the 20th century and everything like that, that they were not there in the early documentation and all in that space. So even though it's a very popular, you go to the dollar bill and it's got that Christian slogan and everything, and there's some other things that are seen as being part of our institution of government that were instituted much later. I want to say even some of the things that we celebrate, like the Star Spangled Banner and some of the other things might have come up later as well, and everything in some of the world wars and all in that space. So how much of our misinterpretation of history is part of the problem as well?
I think it's a great point, Mark, and it's a big part of it. I mean, Americans are consistently misinterpreting history. Now, lots of history is open to a variety of interpretations, but many interpretations can't be squared at all with the basic facts. And a larger point that's related is civics. Basic understanding of civics and how our government works is shockingly lacking. The University of Pennsylvania Annenberg School of Communication does a poll every year, asks lots of questions. And, half the country doesn't have a basic sense of what the First Amendment's all about. A huge chunk of the country doesn't really have a good handle on the three branches of government, right? The executive, the legislative, the judicial branch, and what they do, what their functions are. So it's really striking. And democracy is rooted in the people, right? Our representatives are supposed to come in and represent the people and listen to the people and enact legislation and enforce laws consistent with what the people want in a general sense. And if the people are just totally unmoored from our history, from the basic underpinnings of how our government works, it's not going to go as well as it could, to put it mildly.
No, and along those same lines, it's interesting you bring that up because I was talking to a lady that used to be a teacher in the New York school system. I think she's also done some acting and is part of the another institution in addition to Pod TV that I work with, which is an African American Cultural Arts Center, the Hayti Heritage Center. But we were remembering, and it wasn't that long ago when a lot of our kids were hearing I'm Just a Bill and some of the other kind of things that dealt with legislation and all along those lines. And while I don't have any kids of my own, I do have nephews, and I sometimes wonder how much of the basic principles they're even learning, because there was that whole notion, I think I'm Just a Bill, and some of the others were part of Schoolhouse Rocks, and I don't even know if Schoolhouse Rocks is still out there as much as it used to be. So do you feel that our school systems are not teaching enough of basic civics, and that is part of the problem?
It is. I mean, civics is really important. It just is. You need to understand the basics. Not everybody needs to be a wonk. Not everybody needs to be like you, Mark, and have this deep understanding of history and how all these things work. But people need to just understand where they sit in this country and how the country works, and as a citizen, what that means, who the representatives are, what people are involved in shaping their lives in these really important ways. And what's happened, I think, over time is the American experiment has been a great success in a lot of ways. It's not perfect. We made lots of mistakes. There's lots of things we could have done better from the beginning until now. But in general, it's been a success, and people on average live a lot better in the United States today than people have lived throughout history in other countries and even in our own country early on. And I think there's a complacency and just a sense of taking things for granted, that the stability that we have compared to historical government structures is just the natural state of affairs. It's not. Things can change. Things can go sideways. And a really important part of keeping things going the right way is a basic understanding of how things work, being informed at the ballot box, understanding how the system works, and what our roles as citizens are within that system.
And you mentioned another word earlier today, and I'd love to hear your take on this, even from the standpoint of understanding history and civics and all along those lines. So I've actually had this argument with some people even here on the network and everything, because in my understanding, gentrification, and you mentioned that earlier, has been a very powerful tool in terms of dismantling things and all along those lines. Because like I said, I literally grew up in a rural town, Warrenton, North Carolina, in terms of my teen years and everything. But I was born here in Durham, North Carolina, which is one of the original, along with Tulsa, Oklahoma, and a number of others, Black Wall Streets. But it was intentionally had destroyed when the highway went through it. And it was the people that made that decision to have the highway go through it, even though it was a vibrant and thriving African American business community. And I know that even in various cities around the country, there are intentional divides, walls, and highways and other things that are put in that intentionally divide us, and all along those lines. But when I brought it up even to some of my fellow panelists on this network, they're thinking that institutional racism isn't as much of a real thing as I feel it is, and all along those lines. And they sometimes think that we are playing that victim mentality. That's a common term that people have to love to use and everything along those lines. But what do you say to folks, since the gentrification is part of what you've studied as well, when they don't see that their gentrification can be a very real thing? Like I said, the part of Durham that was called the Black Wall Street was very vibrant, had a lot of various businesses, and ironically was supported by some of the white elite, including the Dukes and everything along those lines. But then when the Department of Transportation, ironically a federal agency, decided where they would get the best use of highway property in terms of making an interstate highway, they chose an area that was, while vibrant, also from their standpoint, something that would be better to have that interstate up and down traffic. So they opted to destroy that, and they got some people to buy into it, including some of the leaders of that community at that time and everything, and made promises, some promises that were thwarted and unkept, and all along those lines. But I just wanted your take on gentrification, because it is something that we're even seeing now. I think in New York, we're seeing it in Harlem, and in various places around Pennsylvania and around Georgia, we're seeing it as well. So it seems to be an issue. It was an issue in the 60s when I was a baby, and it's even an issue in the year 2024. So what is your take on gentrification and its role in politics? I think we're even seeing it in some of the voting things that are going on this time around, and what some people are considering voter suppression.
Yeah, it's a big issue. You're right, Mark, that it's important. Been around a long time. Certainly something that impacts many, many millions of Americans every day. And there's that history. There's a history. I talk about the Tulsa Race Massacre in the book. One of the things that I talk about in the book is our history, and how it's important to not just celebrate the good things in our history, but also acknowledge the bad things. And gentrification and the Tulsa Race Massacre, there have been lots of really negative things too. It's important to take the whole, right? Try to take the whole and figure out what the best balance of things are. But I think in all, you're right. It's an important issue, something that we should all be focused on.
Now, I know one of the things you had, and I'd love to hear a little more about this French quote that is something that was, I guess, put in your book and everything, but somebody was mentioned it and everything, which is de Tocqueville, and it's the greatness of America lies in not being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the things that I do for the Hey Tired Center, in addition to being a site coordinator and sometimes consultant on their various events, is I'm considered one of the staff historians. And I like to say that I love to talk about that history, warts and all. So one of the things that I will oftentimes do is I will bring up a veve, which is a Haitian symbol that is up at the top of the building and all along those lines. And there's different interpretations as to what it represents. Some people think it represents Papa Legbe, and other people think it represents Ursula, but there is definitely a Haitian connection there. But I also will point out the biggest stained glass in the building, which is a converted AME church and everything, which actually belongs to Mr. Duke. And yeah, I'm talking about Mr. Duke of the Duke family, and all along those lines. And his stained glass is even bigger than that of Jesus Christ. And there are two stained glasses of Jesus Christ. So one of the things that I love to do is bring up what you just did, which is the notion of history, warts and all. But I don't know that we do enough of that and all in that space. So is that something else that we can do a better job of, is exploring both the good sides of our history and the negative sides of history, and not necessarily a whitewashing sides of what is going on, which I sometimes feel both sides of politics do too much of, is whitewashing it to appease whatever their opinion is.
Absolutely. I mean, look, if you're a politician or a political operative who earns your paycheck being in politics, you have incentives to create narratives, to tell stories from a certain angle. Okay, you want to get people to vote for you, right? That's your job. But if you're a citizen, if you're just waking up in the morning and you've got a job and you're going about your life, you've got your family, your incentives, to me, should be to be accurate. Your incentive should be to understand reality, be accurate, cast intelligent votes, contribute to your community in ways that impact things in a positive way, and having a good handle on cause and effect and history and how things work. The idea that a citizen should just wake up in the morning and have all of these, inaccurate, highly charged, partisan perspectives on all these things and just howl into the wind things that aren't true and don't make sense, it's baffling. I think we should, as citizens, try to be informed and accurate, and then let the chips fall where they may politically. I mean, sometimes Democrats are right, sometimes Republicans are right. I think it's fair to think one is better than the other and all of that. But the idea that you should just jump on your bandwagon and spin out these cartoon narratives at one side or the other, when you're just a citizen and you're trying to participate in society, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's much better to be right and independent than wrong and in good standing in your tribe.
Yeah, that makes sense. And along those same lines, everything. One of the things that has oftentimes fascinated me, and I'm not going to say actually the last time I voted, which was a couple of days ago, and everything in the last days of early voting and all in that space, is this notion of a lot of people, in my mind, vote according to what people are dictating to them to vote. Because I wish that the electorate would be more informed. But I know a lot of people that are, for lack of a better term, and I think both talk about this, the lazy voters. So they will get the letter from the Sierra Club or whatever the PACs are, because we've got various PACs here in Durham, North Carolina, and they will vote according to what those PACs have determined that they should vote. And then if you even ask them why they voted, and I know we voted as a private thing, and a lot of people don't know which way you voted, one way or the other, but if you push them on it, a lot of people will admit that they have voted according to what the sheet of paper told them to vote, and sometimes it's even from the different parties as well. So I just wanted your take on that, because that to me can be frustrating. And I'm not saying you got to know every issue, because we know there's a lot of issues, including the local politics, that are impacting us in some ways even more than the federal politics and everything, like who's your sanitation commissioner, if you have one of those, or who's your zoning person, and a number of other kinds of jobs that are important like that and everything. But what is your take on this rise of the PACs and the interest groups that seem to control a lot of the way people vote?
Yeah, it's not healthy. I mean, I think the basic premise of democracy is that everybody's vote is equal. One person, one vote. It's impossible to get that perfect. It's just, especially in a country our size, there's going to be frictions and imperfections, and certainly at the margins you're going to have challenges. But that should be the goal. The goal should be every adult has a vote, and the closer we can get to it, the better, and that it's all equal, and that it's not disrupted by rules, that it's not impacted by huge pools of money pouring in and impacting things unfairly. I mean, we should want our democracy to function in a fair way. I mean, that's the basic premise of the system. There's lots of distortions, and Mark, I think you put your finger on one of them, which is, heavy concentrations of power that can do a whole lot to influence things that an ordinary citizen might not be able to. And all that does is distort the franchise. It's something that we should try to push back on.
Yeah. And one of the theories that has gone on, and I think it happened even with one of the other people that you mentioned in your book and everything, because I do remember when Jesse Helms was living, and I definitely remember Newt Gingrich and the Tea Party. And there are some people that would argue, I'm not saying that they're right, that the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is a continuation of that wing and everything along those lines. There are other people that are saying that it's just people that are frustrated with the system, kind of that drain the swamp kind of crowd and everything. And I've heard similar kind of things from the left, because I think that even Obama himself wasn't too pleased with the structure of the system and all along those lines. So I just wondering how much, well, two things. One, do you think that Newt Gingrich and the Tea Party are connected to the MAGA wing? And then if I can add the second part of that, do you think that there is dissatisfaction overall with the political system, which is why we've had a rise of both the MAGA wing and I would argue a rise of Obama as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the origins of MAGA can be found in the Tea Party and probably predate that. There tends to be long historical lines to big, powerful movements. And I think it first became really prominent with Newt Gingrich and Republicans in Congress, and then the Tea Party. Just the anger, the willingness to do things that are irrational and hurt everybody in politics. I think that those are really important origins of what we see now. And yes, there's a dissatisfaction. I think there's a couple principal reasons for the dissatisfaction. One of them is what I talked about earlier. I think a lot of people just take for granted how the system is working, and their expectations for what government can do have been distorted by relative peace and prosperity now in the United States compared to historical comparisons for decades and decades, and people are just don't have a good context for what government's supposed to do and capable of doing. So government gets a lot of blame. there's plenty of room for improvement with government. Don't get me wrong, but I think sometimes it gets blamed unfairly, and that leads to resentment. Another big factor behind the disillusionment with government, I think, is globalization. The globalization played a huge role in making the economy function the way it does. Stock prices have gone up tremendously over the last several decades. A big part of that is because U.S. companies are now overseas so much more, and there's so much more revenue flowing into the country because of that. But that unseated a lot of local businesses, a lot of steel mills in swing states and small towns, and companies that used to do things in their town, and families that used to run those companies have been decimated. And there's economic arguments for why that's okay, right? It lowers prices for people, creates a more efficient system. But the victims, the roadkill, so to speak, have been very, very damaged, and they're angry. And I think that's a part of it as well. A lot of that is gravitated towards the MAGA movement. So there's a lot of disillusionment, and I think some pretty palpable reasons why.
Along those same lines, the other thing that I've heard a lot of people talk about in the political landscape is this notion of institutions, and we kind of alluded to one of them because, like I said, I did grow up in the Walter Cronkite era of media and everything, but there's also been a notion of the politicization of other institutions, including the Supreme Court. I know a lot of people, not just women, but others, that were upset at the decision of Dobbs and all along those lines, and the overturning of Roe versus Wade and everything. So there are definitely some people that were upset about that, and
Absolutely.
were feeling that it wasn't that it was more political. But then you've got people, including some people on this network, that have said that it always should have been a states' rights issue, and all along those lines. So what is your thoughts around it? Because even Trump himself has said that he feels that the courts have been politicized against him. And I know that there are people on the left, including members of the squad, that would probably argue the same, but from their perspective and everything. So what is your take on some of these institutions that in the past were seen as being quote unquote neutral, even though they took some very controversial views, even when they had the views of desegregation and all along those lines? But so that would be a political view as well. But what is your take on that as an author?
Yeah, there's lots of big reasons why people are upset. I think the court is a good example. So to me, if you need, you can go again. You can always go back further and find connective tissue with these things. But I think Bush v. Gore in 2001, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of George W. Bush, and he won the presidency over Al Gore as a result. I think that was an enormous moment for the country, for obvious reasons, but particularly with the court, because George W. Bush turned around and nominated John Roberts and Samuel Alito. So the court went right, when if Bush had won, if Gore had won, it would have gone left. And so the Supreme Court's decision radically changed the course of history for itself. And it was a hard decision, and the Supreme Court had to make a decision, and it was going to upset half the country no matter what it did. So it just worked out that way. But I think Democrats and liberals were deeply injured and offended and angered by that. And then watching Roberts, watching Alito. And then fast forward a few years, Mitch McConnell refuses to confirm Merrick Garland. Instead, you get Neil Gorsuch. Then Kavanaugh's hearings were very explosive. And then Ginsburg passes away. And instead of saying, nope, we're not going to confirm anyone because it's the last few months before the presidential election, just like we didn't confirm Garland, the Republicans totally flip-flopped, confirmed Amy Coney Barrett. So right now there's 6 conservatives, 3 liberals. If things had gone differently, Bush v. Gore, Merrick Garland, Amy Coney Barrett, just slight tweaks in history, that would be completely reversed, and the liberals would be dominating the Supreme Court. And the court, for better or for worse, and I think for worse, decides these huge, huge important issues in American society. And so these losses that were so close and felt illegitimate to the losing side have played a huge role in people's anger. No doubt about it.
Yeah, just along the same lines and everything, there's this notion that if a party loses, they will have to reassess themselves and everything, or that there might be an implosion. That's some of what I'm hearing in media outlets, not just here on Pod TV, but just in general, because there's some speculation that if Trump loses, that MAGA will maybe implode, kind of the way that some people would say the Tea Party imploded and everything. But I'm also hearing people that are saying that if the Democrats lose and Kamala Harris doesn't win, that the Democratic Party will have to reassess its viewpoints and maybe become a little bit more center, because there are some people that argue that it's gone a little bit too far left, even though I personally think that people like the Squad and some of the people that are part of the Squad, including Rashida, who's out of Michigan and has certain views around the Palestinian situation, would argue that it hasn't gone far enough to the left and everything. But then there's been talk about how that because of certain things that have happened within their organization as well, it's a much smaller organization, that they have had some implosion as well. I'm thinking about Jamal Bowman and what went on with him and a couple of others that lost and everything. So how much is there safeguards in the system in that some of these movements, for lack of a better term, wind up either imploding or sometimes being sabotaged from without? Because I think that that's what a lot of people that study history would argue happened to, like, the Black Panthers and some of the civil rights leaders, because there is no doubt that some of our government institutions targeted some of the leaders, whether they were moderate or whether they were a little bit more far left and everything. So what is your take on some of this kind of implosions?
It's a great question, and I think to me the Democrats and Republicans are different. I think the Democrats have gotten too carried away in certain respects and too radical in certain ways, but I think it's all within the normal range, right? I think it's normal that political parties can have phases where the moderates have too much impact, phases where the extremists have too much impact. So it all feels normal, including a very wide variety of views and lots of dysfunction, but normal. That's what a normal political party is prone to do. The Republicans is very different. It's very abnormal. It's an extreme outlier. I think Donald Trump is truly unique, truly an outlier, truly an aberration. I think if the Republicans lose this presidential election and Trump finally is off the scene as the Republicans' champion, I think you'll see a dramatic change. It's very hard to predict what that'll look like, but the party's so entwined with Trump that it has to change dramatically. My prediction, and perhaps this is diluted by motivated reasoning because it's what I really want to have happen, but my prediction is that Trump will lose and there will be a reversion towards the mean in the Republican Party, and it'll go back to resembling much more what it used to look like when people like Mitt Romney and John McCain were its champion. There were still elements of extremists within the party, as again there always are, but the party itself was much more coherent and rational, and that's what I think is going to happen over the next few years, a reversion to that more rational Republican Party.
What about on the Democratic side? And then I know we're getting ready to wrap very shortly and everything, but what about on the Democratic side? Because like I said, there have been some people that felt that Bernie did not get the respect that he needed to get from the Bernie, as far as the Bernie bros are concerned. And like I said, the Squad seems to have even moved to a more centrist view. And some people would say that AOC might have been a little bit more radical, and some of her partners still have some radical views around certain things, particularly around the Middle East and all along those lines, or what are perceived as radical. I don't necessarily always think that they are radical, but I know that that is the perception and everything. So do you think that there's going to be a push toward the centrist side in the Democratic Party?
It's hard to predict. Joe Biden was a centrist in general, I think, but he was able to work well with the progressives, and he beat Trump, inaugurated in 2021. I don't think Kamala Harris is a radical either. I think she's more moderate than anything. If you look past some of the rhetoric and things she said while campaigning at various times in her career, she's actually pretty moderate. So my sense with the Democrats is, again, a much more normal. They'll learn lessons, but the aberration of Trump also makes whatever happens with Trump less applicable in the future, right? There's less lessons to learn necessarily because it's very unlikely in 4 years Trump runs again. I mean, he'll be in his mid 80s at that point, and just actuarially, that'll be difficult to happen. Certainly can't rule it out, but I think the Democrats are more in a traditional realm of learning lessons, making adjustments, courting constituencies, but not in sort of this, convulsion that the Republicans find themselves in.
Well, the last question I was going to ask you as we get ready to head out the door, and I definitely appreciate this conversation. Hopefully, you can come back on this show and some of our other shows as well, maybe even after the election. But on just about all my shows, I ask folks to tell how they can be reached if you want to share the book, and we will put it on our bookstore if that's all right with you, because we have a bookstore attached to Pod TV and everything. It's an Amazon bookstore and everything like that, and I'll gladly add yours to that list. And we got David Walker's and other books on there as well as various other past guests. But if you want to tell how they can get a copy of the book and just in general, and any other words that you didn't get to that you'd like to share. And I, on most of my shows, love people to give a message of positivity, because Pod TV is a global network, so it's something I try to get all my guests to do on all the shows that I'm part of, call it my own personal ministry, and all along those lines and everything. But any words of positivity that you would like to share, how you can be reached, and any last words that you would like to share that you haven't got to.
Thanks, Mark. It's been really great to be on your show. I'd love to come back and really appreciate your time. I'm easy to find online. I write column for Newsweek. I also have a website, will-cooper.com. That's WILL-COOPER.com. And my book, How America Works and Why It Doesn't, very easy to Google that and find it at your online bookstore or your local bookstore as well. Really love to come on and talk about these things. You have a great show, so appreciate you having me. Positivity, super important, the best place we could end. Thank you for teeing that up. I think we should be positive about the election. It's going to be a white knuckle few days, maybe even few weeks. But I think no matter what happens, looking at things through the long arc of history, the United States will be okay. We will muddle through whatever happens, and we can all be thankful for, the general stability that we have in this country, and the many things that we have, the abundance that we have here. Most of us do, not just the wealthy, but most Americans compared to the way people lived before, and that's something we can all appreciate, no matter what happens at the polls.
No doubt about that. Just really quickly, as we're heading out the door now, I'll play that same intro that I played at the beginning for those that have not voted. And like I said, I know here in North Carolina, we had record-breaking voting turnout and everything, but a number of people will be voting on tomorrow. So I'm urging everybody to vote. So do you have any thoughts as to why people should go out and vote tomorrow if they didn't do early voting? Like I said, I'm assuming you were probably an early voter. I know I was an early voter. As I was talking to my mom, she reminded me that my younger brother and only brother, because that's just the two of us in terms of siblings and everything, likes to vote the day of. And I know that there are some other people that like that attitude as well. They're not big fans of early voting. They like that system of going the day of for whatever reasons. Maybe it's just a tradition or whatever along those lines. So what would you say to those that have not voted, that want to vote, no matter what the side of the aisle that they are hoping to vote for, in terms of the importance of voting? Before I play this closing video, there was the opening video as well.
Get out and vote. It's super important. First, though, do some research. Learn about what you're voting for. Make an informed decision. I think both of those come together. Just being informed but not voting, just voting but not being informed. Neither of those alternatives is what this country's all about, what our democracy is all about. So read a book, read the paper, do some online research, figure out what's happening, and then go cast a vote in a way where you think the right candidate can make yourself, your community, your country better.
Yeah, appreciate you saying that. The other thing I would add to that is to vote on the down ballots as well, because as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times those kind of offices can be just as important, if not more important, in your day-to-day life than the president. And I'm not knocking the president, but I do know that a lot of those, whether it's your city council, your town commissioner, the person in charge of sanitation, the people that, even the dog catchers, that for those people that have things like the dog catcher and things like that, that those down ballots can be important as well. But as William Cooper said, study their positions as well, because you don't want to just vote for him because he's your best friend. You want him to actually have the qualifications for the job, and all along those lines, and all in that space. So definitely vote the down ballot, but also make sure that you are staying informed on the down ballot as well. So on that note, we get ready to get out of here. I've had a fun time in this almost hour-long conversation with William Cooper, and look forward to having him come back in the near future, maybe even on our political analysis shows that we've got here on the network, including one that we'll be doing on the day of. And I think American Politics is going on right about now, or it'll be going on later on this afternoon, which is a new show that's analyzing politics here on Pod TV as well. And that one then features David Walker, who I mentioned earlier, and Steve Rao, a city councilman for this area, who is out of the Morrisville area, Morrisville, North Carolina, which is a suburb of Raleigh. But on that note, we're getting ready to get out of here, but we got other exciting programs, including a lot that'll be dealing with the elections over the next 24 hours. And like William said, we might be talking about it a week or two later, still trying to figure out who won or who lost and all along those lines. But definitely looking forward to the conversation with many people over the next several days. And last but not least, if you're here in Durham, North Carolina, and all along those lines, that other place I'm going to run to in about an hour and a half, the Hayti Heritage Center, will be having an election watch party. So you can get some drinks, you can get some, maybe even some food. I'm not sure that they'll be providing that. And you can either be happy or sad, depending on what the results are and what you are hoping the results will be. But you can at least do it in the company with other people as well. And then I think Reverend Barber, who many people know as the repairer of the breach, is scheduled to speak on Friday. So he'll be at that venue on Friday, and he'll either be very happy or very sad himself, because I know that he's very much in the progressive or liberal camp and all along those lines. So he'll either be cheering on the victory of Kamala, or he might be frustrated at the victory of Trump. But as I like to say, only time will tell, and we'll find that out as we get ready to get on out of here. So like I said, William, great having you here, and I look forward to having you back in the near future.
Thank you.